I believe in miracles, of course. I believe that perhaps someday there may be mutinies large enough to bring an end to war. Who knows what will happen?
I'm Colleen Dulle. Welcome to Conversations with America. When Pope Francis addressed Congress in 2015, he spoke about four great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. Perhaps the least famous of the group, Dorothy Day was the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. She operated the Catholic Worker newspaper and opened houses of hospitality that provided food and clothing to people in need. The group remains at the forefront of nonviolent agitation against war and nuclear weapons, and Day's canonization cause is being considered by the Catholic Church. Joining me today is Martin Doblmeier, the filmmaker behind the new documentary Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day story, which premiered on PBS March 6th. Welcome to the show, Martin.
Nice to be here, Colleen. Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, why make a film about Dorothy now, in 2020?
Well, I think that without question in my own mind that Dorothy Day probably is the most fascinating, I think challenging and courageous American figure of the 20th century. Not just a Catholic figure or a woman, I think just across the board one of the most engaging, dynamic, dramatic figures of the 20th century. I think she's fascinating because she embodies this tension, this natural tension between being a very traditional Catholic, who attends Mass every day, prays the Rosary, reveres the saints, studies them. That's a traditional Catholic, in my mind. And yet at the same time, she is an anarchist at heart, a revolutionary at heart. And she seamlessly puts those two things together. So that's what I think makes it really fascinating. And then I think she's also challenging because for me, at least, as a Catholic, as a person of faith, you can't look at her life and not think to yourself, well, am I living my own faith up to the same standards and level and the same kind of commitment and no compromise commitment that Dorothy Day did? And then I think, third of all, in terms of courage, imagine 1933. Put yourself in the mindset of 1933. You have 12 million unemployed, desperate people in this country. And she decides to open the doors and say, all are welcome. We're going to feed you and take care of you. And a woman doing this in 1933. And then during the middle of World War II, she decides that we're going to stay pacifist. And imagine all the pushback that she would have gotten, all the letters and all the anger that was sort of reverberating around America about not being courageous enough to step up. And she saw courage taking her in a different path. So to me, that's why she's fascinating. She's challenging, and she's just as courageous as all get out. And that for me as a filmmaker, that's a perfect combination.
Absolutely. She's such a captivating character. You were interested in her for a long time. Can you tell me a little about your background with Dorothy?
Well, I was a very young writer at the Providence Visitor, which is the Catholic newspaper in Providence, Rhode Island. It was my very first job. I have a degree in religious studies. I just gotten through studying religion formally and wanted to see if I wanted to sort of dip my toe in being a journalist of some kind. And so I would spend the days at the office of the newspaper, and we would have stories coming across the old teletype machine about Dorothy Day and all the activities that she was up to. So she certainly captures your spiritual imagination right from the get-go. And as I've always been saying, it just seems interesting that I waited 35 years to finally get around to making a film about Dorothy Day, but she certainly was worth the wait.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm wondering about is, you waited 35 years. Why did you decide that she was next?
Well, I'm in the midst of a series of films. I'm doing a series of biographical films for public television, national public television, on people that we consider to be the prophetic voices of the 20th century, religious figures, great religious figures. So the first one was the great American public theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Second one was on the African-American theologian Howard Thurman, who was such a big and important influence, a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. and the entire civil rights movement. And then the third one now is Dorothy Day, and then the fourth one will be, we're in the midst of production for that now too, on the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So I think together the four of them really paint an extraordinary picture of American religious life, and they're really seminal characters that some people would say are being forgotten, and myself, I think they can't be forgotten. I think their contribution to their own time and what they leave to us today can't be ignored.
Right. Now, all the people that you named have kind of, I don't know, they're complex figures in their own ways. I've read a little bit about Howard Thurman and Niebuhr. How do you go about depicting the complexity of someone, and someone so complex as Dorothy in this case, who was a suffragette but never voted, who was a Catholic and a radical, how is it that you approach the challenge of depicting someone so complex in such a short film, 1 hour?
Yeah, that's the big challenge for all of us. I get 1 hour, like you said, and when the Pope mentioned Dorothy Day at Congress, when he came in 2015 and spoke in Congress, I did the interview afterwards with Tim Kaine, Senator Tim Kaine, and Tim was kidding, but he said a lot of his senators and other Congress people came to him later on and said, well, why is the Pope talking about Doris Day? And, and so, but that, that's like a wake-up call for me to say, the truth of the matter is I may have all this background in religion and I got a sense of who she is and the nuances of who Dorothy Day is, but the truth of the matter is the average person on the bus doesn't have a clue.
That's right.
And the first thing that I have to do is I have to convince them to care, to actually get wrapped up in the story in the first three minutes. That's why we create these opens to the film that we're sort of laying it all out, very quick paced, to say, look, here's somebody that you really should be thinking about, especially if you consider yourself a person of faith, no matter what faith, but if you consider yourself a person of faith, look at how she lived her life. And you just start to peel the film apart, and every single day I have to make decisions about, is that worthy? If I've only got 57 minutes to tell the story, is that getting in the cut? And I'll sit around with teams of people and we'll sort of throw out things on the table and I'll sort of watch people's eyes and see what connects. But most of the time it's just instinctive. You just have to hope to God that you're making the right calls. And we sit in an edit room well, you know this because you do television production. You sit in an edit room quietly, a dark room, and you hope to God that you've made the right decisions. But it's not until you bring it out into the public and actually show it in front of people, and you can hear their responses, that you get a sense whether or not this is working at all. And that's been really gratifying. I've been on the road now since the middle of January, doing events all across the country with the film and presenting the film, talking about Dorothy Day and engaging in audience discussions and everything. And I hope I got it right. It remains to be seen, but public television saw the film and they said, yes, let's do it as a special for Women's History Month, and that's been very exciting.
What are some of the things that you had to cut that you wish maybe could have made it?
Well, I'll save it by saying that, yes, it's only 1 hour, but we do have an enormous amount of material that we always include on our website for educational purposes, but all the stuff that doesn't wind up getting put into the film, because we have great people that we interviewed in the film. And so, yes, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make it into the final film, but we hope that we've made the right decisions. One of the things that I didn't get to put into the film that I miss, I think from an artistic point of view, is that it's really interesting that how many artists were attracted to Dorothy Day. So I talked a little bit, or we sort of presented a little bit of Fritz Eichenberg and the wonderful etchings that Fritz did. He was a Quaker, but he was attracted to Dorothy Day for the pacifist peace movement from Dorothy Day. Adi Bethune was another artist that was involved in the Catholic worker right from the get-go. So that whole notion of the artist side and everything, we didn't get to do too much about that. I wish I had more time to talk a little bit about Tamar, Dorothy's only child, and the mother of the 9 children, the grandchildren that Dorothy Day had. I wish I could have spent a little bit more time with that. But overall, hopefully in an hour, millions of people will get a glimpse into the life of Dorothy Day, and they'll see her not only who she is, but how she thought, her own background. One of the things I like to spend time talking about, and because it's of particular interest to me, is how she becomes the person that she is. And a lot of that for her is reading. The people that she read had a huge impact on her life. So some of the other characters in this series, like I mentioned, Howard Thurman, his grandmother was a huge influence in the spiritual formation for him. His grandmother was born enslaved. And she, not until she's in her 20s is she actually freed after the Civil War. But Howard Thurman would always talk about how his grandmother taught him more about God, faith, religion than he ever learned in theology school. Well, it was different for Dorothy Day. She didn't have that kind of personal background when she was growing up. She didn't have a mother and father who were teaching her. She had to go off and do it on her own. So she's reading the Psalms, the Bible. She's reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy through a religious lens. All of this is sort of feeding her soul, and she always talked about feeling haunted by God, and that's a word that's continued to stay with me because I think that really does, that reverberates for me personally. You're always thinking about how God is kind of calling you out in a kind way, but the whole notion that Dorothy Day had about the whole idea of God haunting you always there, always present, calling you out to respond.
Yeah.
I think those are the kind of things that we wanted to make sure that we got into the film, because I feel it, and I think a lot of people in the audience might feel it.
Can we go a little deeper on that? I mean, you've made so many films with these spiritual icons. I wonder, what's been the motivation for you, I guess, personally?
Well, I started this work back a long time ago now, thinking that in the most simplistic way, Colleen. I kept thinking, well, I have a degree in religion. That was in the mind. I was, reading books and kind of attracted to it. And now even today, when my wife and I would go into a bookstore, I head off to the remaining bookstores. Not many bookstores left in America, but when we go into the bookstore, I go off to religion and philosophy, some of history. She goes off to fiction. And then whoever has the most books at the end of the run pays. That's how we do it.
It's a great system.
So, it's fair. I just think it's fair. The fairest way to do it. But this has always been in my mindset. This is always what I've been thinking. So I thought to myself, I majored in religion. I was never really intending on being a minister. That's kind of wasn't me. But I just thought I'd like to put myself in a position whereby every day I can get up and have a reason, an excuse to read these books and meet these people and engage and talk to people about this. And I know deep down inside that I get a chance to engage people, whether it's Jesse Jackson and the civil rights icons that I admire so much, or Martin Sheen, or talk to these people about Dorothy Day or Joan Chittister, who I have great admiration for. And I know that they they entertain me because I'm a filmmaker. That if it was just me reading books, I'm not sure how far I would get. But the filmmaking becomes the avenue for me to be able to engage with these people and talk to these people. And hopefully it continues to feed my own spiritual life. I always say that I don't think of myself first as a filmmaker. I'm pretty clear about that. I'm interested in how God is alive and well and working in the world through the people that we engage with every day. So my interest is religion, and my way to engage with that, to ask questions about that, to speak about it, to create works around that is the filmmaking. But that filmmaking could change at any time. I mean, tomorrow I could just write books or try and do plays or something else. The filmmaking is just a vehicle for me. The real quest in my life is to try to understand how God is alive and well.
And what have you learned?
Well, God is alive and well and haunting the heck out of me all the time, trying to call me into understanding how to think about it in a different and deeper way. And that I look at somebody like Dorothy Day and say, oh my gosh, is it really true? I said to Kate Hennessy, is it really true your grandmother spent 3 hours a day in prayer? How does that happen?
Right. She was so busy.
How do you get that done? And I was just with Simone Campbell from Network the other day, and we did an event together. She's terrific, and she was saying, well, now I feel bad. She says, I feel humbled because I spend an hour a day in prayer, she said, and I think now I'm looking at Dorothy Day, and she spends 3 hours. Where am I going off wrong? But partly I do these films because I love it, but it also calls me to understand, what is God calling me to do? How does God call me to be in the world? And so certainly after having made the film on Dorothy Day, I'm much more intentional now about my prayer life. I'm much more thoughtful about what God is calling me to do. I see people, and I'm trying my best to see people in a different way, so I can reflect what I hope other people will see in her, and that's the point of all of this.
She embodies so much of what we need now, which is genuine empathy for others.
Her life was instinctual. She saw someone fall, she'd help them up. She saw someone hungry, she'd feed them.
She leaves us with a model on how to be authentic, how to have integrity, how to live as if your life really means something.
And she would say, don't call me a saint. I don't want to be written off that easily.
The best documentaries, the best biographies, when you're trying to show a person, they're not just a Wikipedia page, right? They're not just going through, a person's life in order. The best ones say something about a person. What is it that you wanted to say about Dorothy with this film?
Oh, that we're living at an age, I think, when, especially if you only look at the media, you'd be convinced that religion is just run through with hypocrisy. And that there's such disappointment. I talk to people who are disappointed every day in how their religious characters behave, how people who purport to be one way and maybe wear the garb of a particular kind of religion deeply disappoint them. You and I had a conversation about Jean Vanier, who was one of my big heroes.
Mine too.
And I was crushed to hear the story of what had happened to Jean Vanier. And in some ways, I staked my early career on the story of Jean Vanier, and so I feel in some ways robbed about it.
Your first documentary was on him, right?
My first documentary was called The Heart Has Its Reasons. I spent weeks in France with Jean Vanier, came back a champion of Jean Vanier, and remained that until a couple of weeks ago when we found out that everything that he was doing behind closed doors was sinful. And I'm still reeling from that.
Me too.
And so I think those people who decide that they want to announce publicly that they're living a life that God calls them to live, set a standard for us to look at. When they fall really hard. And it is very painful. And one of the things I wanted to say about Dorothy Day is that when you look at her, it seems as though from all the angles that you look at, you may not agree with her. In fact, you may detest some of the political positions that she took. But the truth of the matter is that I think, as it stands right now, is one of the most authentic lives of faith you can possibly imagine. And so despite the fact that you may not agree with her on everything, you can't help but admire her. And that should engender your own sense of God and your own sense of that humanity really does find ways to connect to something greater than itself. And here's a model of somebody who actually did that, and we all benefit from that.
That's right. All right, Martin, thank you so much. Congratulations on the film. Appreciate you coming onto the show.
Thanks. Pleasure. Thank you.
You can watch Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day story on your local public television station and learn more about the film at journeyfilms.com. And for more videos like this, you can subscribe to American Media's YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Ashley McKinless, Associate Editor at American Media and host of the podcast Jesuitical. Thanks for watching our video. If you want to see more from America, hit that red subscribe button right there. Oh no, not that one. The other one. Nice. You're the best.